What's the weirdest reason you got in trouble with the police? It started when our principal banned sign language after claiming kids were using it for secretive gang signs. My younger brother was hard of hearing and we used ASL at home, but with the rule he had to rely on lip reading and his hearing aids during the day. Without signs, he missed half of what teachers said and pretended to understand when he didn't. His grades tanked because he couldn't ask for clarification without exposing that he wasn't following along. I taught him to always sit in the front row where he could see teachers' faces clearly. We developed subtle signals that didn't look like sign language, just scratching our nose or tapping the desk to mean yes or no. He became an expert lip reader out of necessity, studying mouth shapes the way other kids studied flashcards. During fire drills, I'd make sure he followed me since he sometimes missed the announcements if his hearing aids were acting up or the batteries died, which happened constantly because the school nurse kept confiscating his extras, saying they could be drug paraphernalia. The hardest part was watching him struggle through presentations and group work where multiple people talked at once and he couldn't track who was speaking. Teachers thought he was shy or slow, not understanding he was missing entire conversations. One teacher even recommended him for special education evaluation, not because he was hard of hearing, but because she thought he had cognitive delays. I wanted to interpret for him so badly, but even finger spelling would get us both suspended. The principal had already given warnings to 3 deaf students who'd accidentally signed to each other in the hallway, calling their parents about defiant behavior. He started having anxiety attacks about school, sitting in class terrified someone would ask him something he didn't hear. I'd see him at lunch, alone because he couldn't follow conversations in the noisy cafeteria, pretending to read so nobody would try to talk to him. His audiologist said his hearing was getting worse from the stress, that he was experiencing selective auditory shutdown from the constant strain of trying to understand without visual language support. The doctor wanted to write a letter to the school requiring ASL accommodation, but my parents knew that would just get him labeled as a troublemaker. During chemistry class, someone knocked over a cart full of chemicals that created toxic fumes when they mixed. The teacher screamed for everyone to get to the emergency shower station while she grabbed the gas masks from the storage cabinet. The alarm was blaring so loud it hurt, and thick yellow smoke was filling the room. The teacher was trying to shout instructions through the plastic mask, but even I could barely understand her muffled voice saying something that sounded like not, or stop, or hot. Everyone was pushing toward the emergency shower thinking that's where we were supposed to go, but the teacher was actually saying not to go there because the spill was spreading that direction. Through the chaos and the fogged up masks, I saw my brother following the crowd toward the contamination. He couldn't hear the teacher's corrections through the alarm and couldn't read her lips through the thick plastic mask. His hearing aids were screaming feedback from the alarm, and I could see him pulling at his ears in pain while still moving the wrong direction. I raised my hands to sign, but stopped, knowing there were cameras everywhere. My brother was about to walk directly into the toxic spill that was eating through the floor tiles, actually dissolving them into smoking black puddles. Other kids were pulling their friends back, but nobody knew my brother needed help. The teacher was dealing with the kids closest to the spill, not seeing him heading the wrong way. Someone had already collapsed near the contamination, their skin turning red where the fumes touched it. There was no choice. I jumped onto a desk so he could see me over everyone's heads and signed, "Stop danger chemical there," pointing to show the spill spreading toward the emergency shower. Then signed, "Come here, safe exit this way," using big, clear signs he could see through his fogged mask. He immediately changed direction, and I kept signing to guide him and 4 other kids who followed him to the safe exit. My signing probably saved them from chemical burns that the 3 kids who reached the contaminated area ended up getting on their legs and arms. When the paramedics arrived, they said anyone who'd gotten close to that particular chemical combination would need immediate treatment for lung damage. My brother had been heading straight for the worst of it. The hazmat team said the spill area would have caused permanent respiratory damage to anyone who walked through it without proper protection, and 1 kid was already being life-flighted to the burn unit. The next morning, the principal called me to his office. He had the security footage paused on his computer screen, showing me standing on the desk with my hands clearly forming ASL signs. My brother was already there, sitting in the corner chair with his face pale. "Your brother told me he would have died without your gang signs," the principal said, making air quotes. "But that's exactly what a gang member would say to protect another gang member, isn't it?" He picked up his phone and started dialing. "I've already reported this to the police as suspected gang activity. They're very interested in speaking with both of you." The door opened 20 minutes later, and Officer Marta Cedarglin walked in carrying a notepad and looking confused about why she'd been called. She glanced at the computer screen showing me on the desk with my hands frozen mid-sign, then looked at my brother who was still sitting in the corner chair. The principal started talking fast about gang activity and secret codes while she wrote something down. She asked my brother to come with her to another room for questioning, and he stood up slowly, his face getting even paler. I wanted to go with him, but the principal held up his hand and told me to stay put. My brother looked back at me once before following Officer Cedarglin down the hall, and I could see his hands shaking. The principal turned his computer monitor toward me and clicked play on the security footage again. He kept pausing it every few seconds to point at my hands, forming each sign like he was showing me evidence of a murder. He grabbed a yellow legal pad and started writing down timestamps for every single hand movement I made during the emergency. The footage showed me signing stop, and he circled it on his pad 3 times. Then he took a screenshot of my hands forming the word danger and saved it to a folder on his desktop labeled gang evidence. He muttered something about organized gang activity while replaying the part where I signed chemical. He pulled up another video from 2 weeks ago showing those 3 deaf students signing to each other in the hallway. He pointed at their hands and then at mine on the emergency footage, saying he knew something was wrong back then. I sat there watching him build his case against sign language like it was some kind of drug operation. Officer Cedarglin came back after what felt like forever and asked me to explain what each sign meant. I told her stop meant stop, just regular stop, nothing secret about it. She wrote it down in her notepad like I was confessing to something illegal. I explained that danger meant danger because my brother was about to walk into toxic chemicals. She kept writing without looking up at me. Chemical meant chemical, I said, because there were actual chemicals eating through the floor. She asked if we had other signs that meant different things, and I wanted to scream scream that we had a whole language. The principal interrupted to announce I was suspended immediately for violating the school's sign language ban. He said it didn't matter that it was an emergency because rules were rules, and I'd broken them on camera. The suspension would last until the police investigation was complete, which he said could take weeks or even months. He handed me a yellow form that said, "Suspended for gang-related hand signals," at the top. My brother came back from his interview looking like he might throw up, his face white and his eyes red. I could tell he'd been crying because his hearing aids had those wet marks around them from tears. Officer Cedarglin said we both needed to come to the police station tomorrow morning for formal statements. She gave us each a business card with the station address and told us not to be late. The principal walked us to the front office where we had to turn in our student IDs and get our backpacks searched. They treated us like criminals, making us sign out in a special book for suspended students. Outside in the parking lot, my brother started breathing too fast and grabbed his chest. I recognized the signs of a panic attack and helped him sit down on the curb. I told him to breathe with me, in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts, while I texted our mom. My fingers were shaking so bad I had to delete and retype the message 3 times. My parents got there in 20 minutes. My dad's truck screeching into the parking lot so fast he almost hit a stop sign. When I told him about the suspension, his face turned dark red and a vein popped out on his forehead. My mom got out and ran to my brother, checking him over like he might be physically hurt. She kept signing, "Are you okay?" before remembering we weren't supposed to use signs anymore. That evening, we sat around our kitchen table with my homework spread out that I couldn't turn in now. My mom opened her laptop and started searching for disability rights laws and ADA violations. She found something about schools being required to provide communication access for deaf and hard of hearing students. Something's not right about how the principal handled this whole situation. Calling actual sign language gang signs makes me wonder what his real problem with ASL is. This school's priorities seem completely backwards when they'd rather let a kid walk into toxic chemicals than allow basic communication that his brother clearly needs to stay safe. My dad was on his phone calling his friend from work who knew a lawyer who might help us. He kept saying sign language and gang signs, and I could hear his friend laughing in disbelief through the phone. Late that night, after my brother went to bed, I stayed up creating a folder on my computer. I found the emails from when the school nurse confiscated his hearing aid batteries and called them drug paraphernalia. I added the letter from that teacher who wanted him tested for cognitive delays instead of understanding he was deaf. The audiologist's report about stress-related hearing loss went in next, along with her recommendation for ASL accommodation. I took screenshots of the school's own emergency procedures that specifically said to communicate clearly during chemical spills. I found the part about using all available means to ensure student safety during emergencies. The next morning, we drove to the police station in silence, my brother staring out the window at nothing. Detective Eric Birchgrove met us in the lobby and seemed confused about why we were even there. He was older than Officer Cedarglin with gray hair and looked tired like he'd been working all night. He took us to an interview room and pulled up the security footage on his laptop. After watching it twice, he turned to the principal who'd come with us and asked him to explain something. He wanted to know how warning someone about toxic chemicals could possibly be gang activity. The principal started his speech about secret codes and organized communication, but the detective cut him off. My brother had to write out a statement about what happened during the chemical spill. His hand shook as he wrote about not being able to hear the teacher through her gas mask. He explained how the alarm feedback hurt his ears so bad he couldn't think straight. He wrote that he would have walked directly into the spill without my signs warning him to stop. When he got to the part about almost dying, he had to stop writing because his hand was shaking too much. The detective read his statement and looked at the principal like he was insane for calling this gang activity. 20 minutes later, the door to the interview room opened and my parents rushed in with a man in a gray suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. My mom went straight to my brother and checked him over while my dad's face stayed red with anger he was trying to control. The man set his briefcase on the table and pulled out business cards that said Connor Mapleridge, disability rights attorney, then started asking Detective Birchgrove for copies of everything. Connor looked at the security footage on the detective's laptop, watched my brother's written statement get passed across the table, and started taking photos of every document with his phone. He told Detective Birchgrove this whole thing was an ADA violation, and the real crime was denying a hard-of-hearing student his right to communicate. The detective nodded and seemed relieved someone else was saying what he'd been thinking. Connor left the police station with us and spent the whole car ride home on his phone, calling different offices and leaving voicemails about emergency complaints. That afternoon, he drove to the district office and filed paperwork with the Office for Civil Rights while we waited in the lobby watching other parents come and go with their own problems. He came back out with copies stamped received and told us he'd scheduled a meeting with the district's 504 coordinator for next week. Connor warned us the school would probably make things harder now, but said we had one of the strongest cases he'd ever seen. My phone started blowing up with notifications as news spread through social media about the chemical spill and the kids who got burned. 3 of them were still in the hospital with burns on their legs and arms from where the chemicals ate through their clothes. Parents on the school Facebook page were asking how some kids knew to avoid the spill while others walked right into it. Someone posted a blurry photo of me standing on the desk signing, and the comments exploded with people arguing about whether I'd saved lives or broken rules. 2 days later, a woman named Joanna Rosegrove showed up at the school with a clipboard and started following my brother to his classes. She sat in the back taking notes every time he couldn't follow a discussion when multiple people talked at once. In English class, she watched him miss the teacher's instructions about group work because he was looking down at his paper when she spoke. During math, she saw him pretend to understand when the teacher explained something while facing the board. She wrote everything down in her notebook, and I could see my brother getting more nervous with her watching him struggle all day. At lunch, I walked through the cafeteria and heard whispers following me, some kids calling me a gang member under their breath, while others came up to thank me for the warning that saved them from the chemicals. The whole school felt split down the middle, with some kids wearing homemade signs that said safety first, while others had ASL is not a crime written on their notebooks. Teachers tried to stay neutral, but you could tell which ones thought the ban was stupid by how they looked at my brother when he couldn't couldn't understand them. Connor called the chemistry teacher at her home that evening, and she agreed to write a statement about what happened during the spill. She typed up 2 pages explaining how my signs prevented more injuries and probably saved several students from permanent lung damage. She was scared to say anything publicly because she needed her job to support her kids, but she signed the sworn statement and emailed it to Connor for our files. The next morning, the principal sent out a school-wide email that popped up on everyone's phones during first period. He wrote about maintaining safety standards and keeping our school gang-free through zero tolerance for hand signals of any kind. He reminded everyone that the sign language ban was still in full effect, and any violations would result in immediate suspension. Kids started taking screenshots and posting them online with angry comments about discrimination. 3 days after that, my brother woke up gasping for air and clutching his chest, so we rushed him to urgent care at 5 in the morning. The doctor listened to his lungs and ran tests while my brother sat there shaking and trying to breathe normally. She said it was a panic attack brought on by severe anxiety and asked what was causing so much stress in his life. My mom explained about the communication barriers at the school and how he couldn't use ASL anymore. The doctor typed up a report saying his anxiety was directly related to being denied his natural language at the school and recommended immediate accommodation to prevent further health problems. She gave us copies for our growing medical file that Connor said we'd need for court. Detective Birchgrove called that afternoon to tell us he was officially closing the gang investigation with a finding of no criminal activity. He'd written in his report that I'd used sign language to save lives during an emergency, and there was zero evidence of any gang connection. The principal called an hour later to say it didn't matter what the police said because violating school policy was different from breaking the law. He said my suspension would continue and my brother still couldn't use ASL regardless of what any detective wrote. The first 504 meeting happened in a conference room at the district office with Joanna Rosegrove sitting across from us with her stack of observation notes. She suggested my brother could use speech-to-text apps on a tablet or carry around written cards with common phrases. Connor leaned forward and told her she was completely missing the point that ASL was my brother's natural language, not some optional tool he could replace with technology. Joanna said she understood, but the school had safety concerns that had to be balanced with individual needs. Connor pulled out a thick folder of federal laws about communication access and started reading sections out loud about equal access to education. My brother sat there silently watching everyone argue about him like he wasn't even in the room, his hands folded tightly in his lap to keep from signing. That night, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was the student who signed during the chemical spill. She said her daughter got second-degree burns on her legs that day, and they were suing the school for unsafe evacuation procedures. She'd heard about my brother's situation from another parent and wondered if we'd share our documentation about how the communication failures made everything worse. I told her we had folders full of evidence and Connor's contact info. Then she mentioned her lawyer was already talking to 2 other families whose kids got hurt. My mom overheard and took the phone, spending the next hour going through dates and details while my brother sat at the kitchen table doing homework. He couldn't understand from classes he couldn't follow. The next morning at the school, the counselor stopped my brother in the hallway and asked him to come to her office during lunch. I watched from down the hall as she led him away, and when he came back 40 minutes later, his eyes were red and his jaw was clenched tight. He wrote on his notebook that she'd suggested he wasn't trying hard enough at lip reading, and maybe he needed to practice more at home, like he wasn't already straining so hard every day that he got headaches by 3rd period. She'd pulled out charts about lip reading techniques and gave him worksheets to practice mouth shapes, completely missing that he'd been an expert lip reader for years. And the problem was that lip reading only catches about 30% of speech, even when you're really good at it. Why does this counselor think worksheets about mouth shapes will fix a system that's clearly broken? My brother's been lip reading his whole life, and she acts like he just discovered it yesterday. There's something really odd about adults who refuse to see what's right in front of them. Connor called that afternoon to say he was filing for emergency injunctive relief to get the sign language ban lifted immediately for my brother, explaining that waiting for the full lawsuit could take months, and my brother needed help now. The district's lawyer responded within hours, arguing it would be unfair to give one student special privileges when the policy applied to everyone equally, like my brother chose to be hard of hearing. 3 days later, during 5th period, the fire alarm went off and everyone started filing out while my brother kept working on his assignment, not hearing the announcement over the intercom about evacuation routes. I ran to his classroom and found him still at his desk while everyone else was already outside, and when I tapped his shoulder, he jumped and looked confused about why the room was empty. I pulled out my phone and recorded him missing the follow-up announcement about returning to class, showing how he had no idea what was happening without visual cues, then added the video to our evidence folder that was getting thicker every day. Later that week, I ran into Officer Cedarglynn at the grocery store, and she pulled me aside near the frozen foods, looking around before telling me she thought the whole investigation was ridiculous. She said she'd been a cop for 15 years and never seen anything stupider than calling sign language gang activity, but her job was to investigate what she was told to investigate, even when it was obviously nonsense. She seemed embarrassed about the whole thing and said she'd already told Detective Birchgrove there was nothing criminal happening, but the principal kept pushing for charges anyway. That same evening, Connor forwarded us a letter from the district's council claiming the sign language ban was a neutral policy that applied equally to all students regardless of ability. Connor called us right after, laughing bitterly, saying that was like banning wheelchairs because everyone had to use stairs equally, and he was adding this letter to the discrimination complaint as evidence of intentional bias. During lunch the next day, I watched my brother teaching 3 friends basic emergency signs using tiny hand movements that wouldn't get noticed by administrators. He showed them help by brushing his thumb across his palm like he was wiping something, danger by tapping his leg twice, and stop by pressing his hand flat against his notebook. They practiced while pretending to eat, keeping their hands low and casual, creating their own secret safety system since the school wouldn't let them use the real one. One of the kids were in my English class and told me later he'd never realized how much my brother was missing until he started paying attention to when teachers gave instructions instructions while facing the board, or when multiple people talked at once. That evening, someone leaked a screenshot from the security footage of me standing on the desk, signing during the chemical spill, and within hours, it was all over the school group chat. The comments ranged from calling me a hero who saved lives to a criminal who broke the rules, with long threads arguing about whether saving people justified using banned signs. My brother saw the posts and started withdrawing even more, skipping lunch to hide in the library and walking to classes with his head down to avoid the stares and whispers. The next week, we had our second 504 meeting, and this time, they brought in a remote ASL interpreter on a laptop screen for my parents, who kept signing their frustration about the situation. The interpreter translated everything my parents signed about accommodation needs and equal access, while the district officials explained through the interpreter why my brother still couldn't use ASL in the school. Nobody seemed to notice the insane irony of using an interpreter to explain why sign language was banned, though Connor kept shaking his head and writing notes about discrimination. The meeting ended with them offering my brother extra time on tests and preferential seating near teachers, which was like offering someone with a broken leg a cushion instead of crutches. Connor spent the next 3 days digging through the district's records and discovered the principal never consulted with any gang experts before implementing the ban. There were no police reports about ASL being used for gang activity, no documentation from gang task forces, no evidence at all except the principal's personal belief that signing looked suspicious. Connor added this to our discrimination complaint, highlighting that the principal made up a policy based on prejudice without any factual basis, affecting every deaf and hard-of-hearing student in the school. 2 days later, my mom drove my brother back to his audiologist for another hearing test since he'd been complaining about worse ringing in his ears. The doctor made him sit in the soundproof booth pressing buttons when he heard beeps while she watched through the window taking notes. She ran the test 3 times because she couldn't believe how much his hearing had dropped in just 2 months. The results showed he'd lost 15% more hearing in the high frequencies, which meant he was missing consonant sounds that made speech clear. She typed up a letter right there in the office, stating his hearing was getting worse fast from the stress of constant lip reading without ASL support. The letter said if he didn't get sign language accommodation immediately, he could have permanent hearing damage from the anxiety and strain. She printed 3 copies and handed them to my mom with instructions to give one to the school nurse, one to the principal, and keep one for our records. That same week, I was sitting at home trying to catch up on 3 weeks of missed AP chemistry assignments while my classmates were doing labs I couldn't make up. My physics teacher emailed saying I dropped from an A to a C because participation was 30% of the grade and suspended students got zeros. The college counselor left a voicemail warning that my suspension would show on transcripts unless I admitted wrongdoing and accepted responsibility. My mom played the message on speaker while we ate dinner, and my dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The principal had called it a disciplinary action for violating safety protocols, even though those protocols would have killed my brother. I spent hours writing practice problems and reading chapters alone at the kitchen table, while my friends texted about group study sessions I couldn't attend. My discipline hearing was scheduled for the following Monday in the district conference room with 3 board members who would decide my fate. Connor prepared a folder with the hazmat report, the chemistry teacher's statement, and screenshots from the security footage showing the toxic spill spreading. I wore my only suit and sat at the long table explaining how my brother couldn't hear the muffled evacuation instructions through the gas mask. The principal interrupted to say policy had to be consistent regardless of circumstances, or every student would claim their violation was an emergency. One board member kept checking her phone, while another shuffled papers, and the third asked why I didn't just point instead of using signs. Connor showed them the footage where pointing wouldn't have been visible through the smoke and chaos, but they said the ban was clear. They offered to reduce my suspension from indefinite to 1 week if I signed a statement acknowledging I knowingly violated school policy. Connor told me not to sign anything that admitted guilt when I'd saved lives, including my brother's. The hearing ended with them saying they'd review the evidence and make a decision within 5 business days. That Thursday, my brother came home early with his backpack dragging on the ground and his eyes red from crying. His history teacher had assigned group projects where 4 students had to discuss primary sources and create a presentation together. The other kids in his group talked over each other while looking at their laptops, so he couldn't see their faces to lip read. When he asked them to repeat things, they got annoyed, and when he missed his turn to contribute, the teacher marked him down for not participating. He went to the bathroom and threw up from the stress, then asked the nurse to call home saying he felt sick. At dinner, he pushed his food around and finally said he wanted to transfer to the state school for the deaf an hour away. My parents exchanged worried looks because that would mean living in dorms and only coming home on weekends, but he said anything was better than this. Connor called the next morning saying a reporter from the local news wanted to interview us about the sign language ban and discrimination. We sat in the living room discussing whether media attention would help our case or make my brother more of a target at the school. Kids already whispered about him in the halls, and some parents on social media were calling our family troublemakers who didn't respect rules. Connor thought public pressure might force the district to change, but my dad worried about my brother facing more harassment from students whose parents supported the principal. We decided to wait and try official channels first, even though Connor warned the legal process moved like molasses in January. The district lawyer called Connor that afternoon with what they called a generous compromise to avoid further legal action. They'd reduce my suspension to 3 days already served and give my brother preferential seating plus written instructions for all assignments. The sign language ban would stay in place for safety and security reasons they couldn't specify due to confidentiality. Connor's voice got loud enough I could hear him through the phone saying it was discriminatory garbage that violated federal law. He told them we rejected their insulting offer and would pursue every legal remedy available, including a federal lawsuit. There's something really strange about this district lawyer calling tiny hand movements under desks more dangerous than a kid missing fire alarms. Makes me wonder what the principal's real problem with sign language. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the police department with Detective Birchgrove's final investigation report clearing us of any gang activity. He'd added a personal note calling my actions heroic and questioning why the school would punish a student for preventing deaths and injuries. The note said any reasonable person would have done the same thing to save lives during a chemical emergency. Connor made copies to add to our evidence file, even though the principal had already said criminal clearance didn't affect school discipline. That Saturday, we drove 40 minutes to a community center where the local deaf community held weekly ASL meetups in their gymnasium. My brother's whole body relaxed the moment we walked in and saw dozens of people signing freely without fear or shame. Kids his age immediately included him in their conversation about video games, while adults shared stories about dealing with discrimination at work and school. One woman who'd fought her own district 20 years ago gave my mom tips about documenting everything and never going to meetings without an advocate. My brother laughed for the first time in weeks playing ASL charades, where teams had to act out movie titles using only signs. On the drive home, he stared out the window, and I saw him practicing signs to himself like he was storing them up for the week ahead. Connor forwarded us the email from the Office for Civil Rights acknowledging our complaint, but warning the investigation could take 6 to 18 months. They couldn't provide interim relief while investigating, which meant my brother would suffer through the rest of the school year without accommodation. Connor started drafting a federal lawsuit as our next option since the administrative process was basically useless for getting immediate help. He said we'd need to show irreparable harm, which was easy given the audiologist's letter about permanent hearing damage from stress. Meanwhile, back at the school during chemistry class, the teacher stood at the front and announced new emergency procedures after the spill incident. She looked directly at the security camera and said students should use any form of communication necessary to save lives during emergencies. Several kids pulled out their phones and started recording as she repeated that safety came before any other policy or rule. One student raised his hand and asked if that included sign language, and she said especially sign language or any other method that could prevent injuries. My brother brought home his report card 2 weeks later with 3 D's and 2 F's, and my mom's hands shook as she read the teacher comments saying he wasn't trying hard enough. The English teacher wrote that he never participated in discussions, even though he sat right in front, not understanding that he couldn't follow when multiple kids talked at once. His math teacher marked him down for not asking questions when confused, but how could he ask when he didn't even know what he'd missed? I watched him do homework for 4 hours straight, writing and erasing the same problems over and over because he'd missed key instructions during class. His notebooks were filled with half-copied notes where he'd given up trying to lip read and write at the same time. The principal caught me alone by my locker on Monday morning, standing too close while other kids walked past us in the hallway. He said my family seemed to be having a hard time adjusting to the school's safety policies, and maybe we should think about whether this was the right place for us. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes were cold, and I noticed the security guard standing nearby like he'd been told to watch. I recorded the whole thing on my phone in my pocket, adding it to our growing pile of evidence that Connor said we'd need for court. Connor spent that whole Tuesday typing up a demand letter on official letterhead, listing every violation of the ADA and giving the district exactly 48 hours to provide ASL accommodation. He attached 20 pages of documentation, including the audiologist's letters, the emergency room visit for my brother's anxiety attack, and screenshots of his dropping grades. The certified mail receipt came back signed by the district superintendent's secretary at 9:47 a.m. on Wednesday, starting our 48-hour countdown. Thursday night's school board meeting packed the auditorium with parents who'd heard about the sign language ban through Facebook groups and Nextdoor posts. The mom whose daughter got chemical burns on her leg stood up during public comment and told everyone how she'd watched the security footage of me signing the warning that saved 4 other kids. Her voice cracked when she described her daughter's skin grafts and said the only gang activity she saw was the administration ganging up on a disabled kid. Another parent yelled that rules were rules, and we couldn't just let kids do whatever they wanted because of political correctness, which started people arguing in the seats. The board president kept banging his gavel trying to restore order, while my brother sat between my parents with his head down, unable to follow the chaos of voices echoing off the walls. Friday afternoon, the district released their official incident report about the chemical spill, admitting that communication failures during evacuation led to preventable injuries but never mentioning the sign language ban. Connor immediately emailed them pointing out this was evidence of a cover-up since they refused to acknowledge that banning ASL directly caused those communication failures. My brother had started carrying a small notebook to every class, frantically scribbling questions while teachers kept talking, missing everything said while he wrote. I'd see him at lunch bent over his notebook trying to fill in gaps from his morning classes, asking other kids what page numbers were assigned or when tests were scheduled. Teachers grew frustrated waiting for him to finish writing responses, and group projects became impossible when he couldn't write fast enough to contribute to discussions. His isolation got worse every day as kids stopped trying to include him in conversations, not out of meanness, but because waiting for him to write killed the flow of normal talking. The discipline committee met Monday morning and decided I'd get a 3-day suspension instead of indefinite, but it would stay on my permanent record as defiance of safety protocols. They added one sentence to the sign language policy saying exceptions could be made for life-threatening emergencies, which Connor called meaningless since who decides what counts as life-threatening in the moment. Joanna created a 504 plan that gave my brother extra time on tests and required teachers to provide written instructions, but ASL was still completely banned in classrooms. Connor said it was like giving someone crutches but telling them they couldn't use their wheelchair, technically an accommodation but not the one actually needed. She seemed frustrated during the meeting, admitting off the record that she knew he needed ASL, but her hands were tied by school policy that she couldn't override. Wednesday morning, Connor filed the federal lawsuit naming the principal personally, along with the district and school board for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. By lunch, the local news had picked up the story with the headline, "Sign Language Ban Controversy Divides Local School," and reporters were calling my parents for interviews. Connor told us not to talk to media yet since anything we said could affect a legal case, but other parents were already giving statements on both sides. A group group of students started a petition during study hall to lift the sign language ban, gathering over 200 signatures in one day. But another group made their own petition supporting the principal's focus on safety, saying we were overreacting and making the school look bad over a reasonable security measure. The hallways felt tense, with students arguing about whether sign language was really dangerous or if the principal had gone too far, and someone wrote "Justice for Deaf Kids" on the bathroom wall. My parents spent that weekend calling every school within driving distance, but the waiting lists were months long, and the private schools cost more than we could afford. Dad printed out transfer applications while Mom mapped out bus routes that would take 2 hours each way, making it impossible with both of them working full shifts at the hospital. The next school board meeting brought a small change when the principal announced he was modifying the policy to allow emergency gestures, but still banned what he called complex sign language systems. He stood at the podium explaining how pointing and basic hand movements were now acceptable in emergencies, but full ASL remained prohibited as potential gang communication. It was like saying you could use 3 letters of the alphabet but not actual words. My brother found 2 kids in his math class who started taking notes for him without being asked, sliding their notebooks over so he could copy what he missed. One girl in English started repeating important instructions when the teacher turned away, whispering directly into his good ear during group work. These small acts helped him keep up slightly better, though he still missed most class discussions and couldn't participate when multiple people talked. Connor called us Thursday afternoon with news that someone at the Department of Justice had seen our lawsuit filing and expressed interest in investigating a potential pattern of discrimination. He explained they were monitoring the case, but wouldn't intervene directly yet, wanting to see how the local proceedings played out first. The next 504 meeting came 2 weeks later, and Joanna sat across from us looking tired as she reviewed my brother's accommodation plan. The detective's personal note calling the sign language ban unreasonable makes me wonder what else the police found during their investigation that didn't make it into the official report. Those emergency gestures sound like the principal's trying to save face while keeping his power trip going. What exactly counts as too complex? She kept glancing at the principal's representative in the corner, then admitted quietly that she knew my brother needed ASL to succeed academically. Her hands fidgeted with her pen as she explained that school policy tied her hands, that she could only work within the existing framework even when she knew it wasn't enough. When my suspension ended, I walked back into school to find gang signs written across my locker in black marker, the letters dripping like they'd used too much ink. Security pulled the footage and claimed the camera angle made it impossible to identify who did it, though I noticed they didn't check the other cameras in the hallway. The janitor gave me some cleaning solution, but the ghost of those words stayed visible no matter how hard I scrubbed. Connor scheduled us for testimony prep sessions every evening for 2 weeks, making us practice explaining specific examples of communication barriers my brother faced daily. We wrote out every incident, from missed fire drill instructions to failed group projects, organizing them into clear patterns of discrimination. My brother practiced writing his answers since he couldn't speak them clearly under stress, his hand cramping from filling notebook after notebook with descriptions of his daily struggles. 6 months crawled by with depositions and motions and delays, until finally the federal judge issued her ruling on a Tuesday morning in May. She declared the sign language ban unconstitutional and discriminatory, ordering the school to immediately provide full ASL accommodation and pay damages for the harm caused. The principal had to send an email to all families explaining that sign language was now permitted and encouraged for all students who needed it. My brother finally raised his hands in class the next day, asking a question in ASL for the first time all year, though most kids still stared like he was doing something wrong. The interpreter they hired started the following week, but the damage was already done with his grades, his anxiety, and his trust in the education system. We both counted down the days until graduation, ready to leave this place that had fought so hard to silence him. Thanks for letting me wonder through all this with you. Definitely been quite a journey to share together. Catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.